Hello, this is Roman, Synthesit. There's a condition called chronic fatigue syndrome. From the name, it might seem straightforward. If a person is constantly tired, they probably have this syndrome. But there's a catch. Officially, medicine recognizes maximum 1% of the population, and only in the big cities people suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome. That means it is considered a fairly rare disease. However, if you look around, you'll notice that actually a lot of people suffer from constant fatigue. According to some polls, up to 31% people in Europe and in the United States feel tired every single day. So, if we use a strict medical criteria for this condition, it's actually quite rare. I think some of you watching suspect that you or maybe your family or relatives might have this chronic fatigue syndrome, and almost likely you are mistaken. Because, I'll say it again, it's a rare diagnosis. In this video, I will explain the official medical criteria for this disease, and you will understand why it's so rare. Or you might realize it's a high time you to see the doctor. I will also share my personal opinion on why these diagnosis criteria are so strict. Frankly, I couldn't find a solid scientific grounds for them. Who created those criteria and why? Most important, I will talk about the most common causes according to some well-known doctors, as well as opinions from people who face this illness and successfully overcome it. I believe this is a very important issue. People often come to us describing how they felt before they taken Synthesit. And even though I'm not a doctor, I understand these were likely cause of chronic fatigue. But it never even crosses anyone's mind to take this problem to a doctor. And I will explain you why it's that. So, the first part, the history of the term and the disease, the mystery of the Lake Tahoe. To give you some context on the issue, the main problem is that people, including doctors, do not believe that this problem exists. This issue is interesting because society doesn't perceive chronic fatigue as a disease. It is seen as a character trait, a negative character trait. And that's actually how it always was until a certain case was documented. The first such case was Florence Nightingale, a British woman who served in Crimean War in 1853 to 1856. She's a very famous figure, considered as a founder of modern nursing. She distinguished herself in that war, saving the lives of her fellow Britons. And upon returning from the war, she began to experience this very state of constant fatigue. And that's when the syndrome was first described. What's interesting is that it was essentially invented because you simply couldn't accuse such a respected person with such merit and service record of being lazy and not wanting to get off the couch. It was obvious that wasn't the cause, because Florence Nightingale was a woman of action. Even in this state, while she was mostly bedridden, she somehow managed to work on documents and projects for local healthcare system. The modern attitude toward this was well described by American physician Dr. Dawn Ellis Knives. She wrote that if you go to a doctor with this problem, the first thing they will likely to do is look at you as if you're just a lazy person. What's interesting is that over all this time, society's attitude toward this problem hasn't really changed. Proving the reality of illness won't be easy if you're not an outstanding or famous person, but just an ordinary individual. And this is despite the fact that medicine in, for example, USA is paid. If you think, you would understand that it would be incredibly profitable for a healthcare system to treat people against such an abstract disease. The story of how the illness itself, not just a term, came into circulation is truly fascinating. In science circles, it's called the Lake Tahoe mystery. This is a small, Lake Tahoe is a small lake in Nevada, USA. It all started in 1984 with a sudden outbreak of an illness that was later classified as chronic fatigue syndrome. Local doctors Paul Cheney and Daniel Peterson noticed the spread among a local population of specific set of complaints: fatigue, headaches, muscle weakness, problem with memory and concentration. When the number of complaints reached a critical level, doctors passed the data to the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. This attracted the attention of specialists who began to investigate the situation. A total of 200 cases were recorded. In 1986, a paper was published. Scientists suggested that illness might be linked to the so-called Epstein-Barr virus. But there's a serious problem with this conclusion. Antibodies to the viruses were not found in 5% of the patient, and in 25% of the cases, the antibody levels were not elevated. Considering that the paper itself states that almost the entire adult population of the United States carries Epstein-Barr virus, these are completely normal indicators. So a major research effort was conducted. A clearly defined illness with a quite specific symptoms was identified, but at the same time, the actual cause of the illness were never found. All these speculation about Epstein-Barr virus, there is something to them, but it's not a fact that it is the cause of the illness. And yet, since then, the perception of chronic fatigue syndrome as a consequence of Epstein-Barr virus activation began. Although, as I said, in 25% of the cases, antibodies were not elevated, meaning they just had the virus at some point in their distant past, and it was not activated. And 5% had no antibodies at all, meaning they had never faced Epstein-Barr virus. And since then, this perception of illness as a consequence of the viral infection has persisted to this day. Dr. Komarovsky mentioned in his shows, Dr. Berg talks about it. In Germany, at the clinic Charité, a famous clinic, a film came out where they were begging for money to do the research about the connection with Epstein-Barr virus and chronic fatigue syndrome, despite the fact there's no connection and everyone understands this. Although in reality a more plausible version sounds like the one from Eric Johnson, who suggested that this outbreak was related to exposure to toxic cyanobacteria and possibly several other toxins, which in turn made this virus more pathogenic. By the way, Eric Johnson himself was the first patient found by Paul Cheney with CFS, but without trace of the Epstein-Barr virus. There's an interview with him on YouTube, very interesting. Take a look. He fell ill with CFS during the 1984 outbreak at the Lake Tahoe and managed to recover by 1990. He believed that there were much in common between Lake Tahoe outbreak and so-called sick building syndrome. So what is a sick building syndrome? It's a condition where people in the building experience discomfort or feel unwell specifically from being in a partial indoor space. Symptoms like headache, dizziness, irritation of eyes, nose and throat, as well as fatigue are usually temporary and go away when a person leaves the building. The causes are well known. Poor ventilation, not enough fresh air coming in can lead to a buildup of pollutants indoors. Chemical pollutants. These can include emissions from construction materials, furniture, carpets, printers and copies. Another cause, biological pollutions. Mold, bacteria, pollen and viruses can also contribute to symptoms. One of the most valuable ideas, in my opinion, is the need to try to avoid mold. He actively promoted the idea that improving indoor air quality could significantly reduce symptoms. He demonstrated this through his own experience and managed to draw attention of the medical community and the public to the potential environmental cause of CFS. And this later stimulated more extensive research in this area. Johnson's recommendations were straightforward. Avoid prolonged stays in places with high humidity and mold. Use natural and eco-friendly cleaning and hygiene products to minimize exposure to chemicals. There's even an entire book written about him by Dr. Lisa Peterson in collaboration. It is called Back from the Edge. The subtitle tells you everything. How one man's discovery brought him from desperately sick with chronic fatigue syndrome to a top of Mountain Whitney in 6 months. I've already mentioned that there has been a serious scientific papers on this topic. For example, like this, sick building syndrome and chronic fatigue syndrome. Here's what they found. CFS is often associated with a sick building syndrome. Both conditions can arise from inadequate ventilation and the presence of specific toxins or microorganisms indoors. Increasing the supply of fresh air sometimes alleviates symptoms, but doesn't always make them disappear. The paper suggests that CFS can develop after exposure to both infectious agents and chemical toxins. This really highlights how difficult it is to pinpoint the specific cause of the condition. And now get back to medical criteria and major issues about medical criteria. The criteria for diagnosing chronic fatigue syndrome are incredibly strict. A person must experience chronic fatigue for at least 6 months and be in the state of exhaustion for no less than 50% of their wake-up time. That means lying around without energy for half a day. In the USA, there's an additional criteria, as this alone doesn't provide a clear clinical picture, so-called concurrent symptoms. And you must have at least 2 of 6. It's memory and concentration problems, sore throat, painful lymph nodes, muscle pain, joint pain. So basically, it's always a pain. You must have a pain to be diagnosed with chronic fatigue. Outside the United States, there is a so-called international consensus criteria created in 2011 by a group of experts. They have a fewer items, but still require 6 months duration and presence of pain. And here's the thing, with all those strict requirements, up to 1% of urban population is still diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. But Dr. Dawn Ellis Snipes, whom I mentioned earlier, briefly notes in one of her videos that in reality up to 7% of population actually suffers from chronic fatigue. They just don't meet this rigid diagnostic criteria. And that's when we realized this illness isn't rare, and actually it's quite common. Let's go to the possible causes according to various doctors. One key consequence of CFS, according to Dr. Snipes, is impaired oxygen supply. This plays a significant role in worsening the symptoms. These issues can affect overall health and contribute to a persistent fatigue. The causes might be related to problems with blood circulation or reduced ability of tissues to absorb oxygen. This lack of oxygen disrupts the production of ATP, the prime energy source for the cells. This leads to a decrease in energy and overall weakness. What Synthesit can fix is your ATP. Just look at our researches about ATP production and about energy metabolism. This young woman, Rylan Egel, isn't a doctor, but she shared how she managed to overcome it. And the key in her case was a lifestyle change. She focused on 3 principles: diet, eliminating harmful foods, and she cut out processed food, added sugar, caffeine. And what's interesting, quitting caffeine significantly improved her energy and well-being. Giving up alcohol was also a crucial step in her recovery. Also, she introduced probiotics and fermented foods. This improved her digestion, gut health, and immune system. Switching to a whole food, plant-based diet also had a positive impact. She also did intermittent fasting and juice cleansing, though I personally have a strong doubts about how beneficial this part is. Another person, this lady Silk de Wolf, with 39k subscribers, she struggled with CFS for 10 years. She believes her illness started after a tough year where she had the flu or cold 3 times, and her family situation wasn't stable. She lived in Belgium, it seems. An interesting point, moving away didn't help her. She tried living in London for a year, but her chronic fatigue even got worse. Her key takeaways, she believed the problem is primarily that certain psychological seminars helped her a lot, whereas acupuncture, yoga, and similar things did not. Overall, she kept telling herself that there was nothing wrong with her physically. However, from a partial standpoint, one significant thing she did was a change in her diet. She added fish, eggs, and other animal-based products to her meals. So, as I mentioned before, a common thread is changing your diet and lifestyle. There are 2 YouTube channels dedicated to CFS. One of them is hosted by Miguel Batista, who talks about his personal experience and approach. This is relevant because he described how doctors' advice often doesn't help and can even make things worse. As an example, he mentioned things like yoga and acupuncture in some cases. From what I understand, Miguel focuses on the idea that this problem with the nervous system, and he tries to treat it by working on stress relief, managing one's stress levels, and etc. However, there's a nuance here. The illness is certainly related to the nervous system. That's clear, but the nervous system is likely not the source of illness. The source is probably something external. In general, a problem with channel is that he promotes his own product, his healing program, which is focused on psychological help. In contrast to this and others, Dr. Hyman emphasizes that chronic illness like chronic fatigue have real cause. They are not psychosomatic. This is why I partially like this person's opinion and experience. This is why I particularly liked his personal opinion and experience. The thing is, over 20 years ago, when he was studying, Dr. Hyman had mercury poisoning and some additional gut problems. When he found and addressed this issue, he was able to solve his own chronic fatigue problem. When a person has problems with something like heavy metals poisoning, of course, psychological help won't fix it. It might make them feel a bit better, but chronic fatigue is an objective condition. According to Dr. Hyman, the root cause of chronic fatigue can include gut problem, Lyme disease, tick-bone infection, mold exposure, heavy metals, inflammation, and free radicals damage the mitochondria, which requires a comprehensive approach to repair. His comprehensive treatment approach involves diet, lifestyle change, stress reduction, gentle physical exercise, and meditations. It's also crucial to eliminate the root causes such as toxins, mold, and heavy metals. Supporting body and adrenal glands with necessary nutrients is also important. Mitochondria. He believes the illness is related to impaired mitochondrial function. The cause of the damage can be one of the things I described earlier, but the result is always chronic fatigue. And this is precisely where Synthesit shows most effectiveness. From the research by Zhoft Radak, we know that Synthesit has a significant influence on mitochondrial biogenesis. It was found to increase ATP production, leading to enhanced metabolism and adaptation processes within cells. Most likely, this proves a small but critical boost at the cellular level, helping the body exit the state of energy deficit. Over time, this allows a person to break free from chronic fatigue and forget about it. So, thank you very much. Goodbye.